Have you ever had an idea pop into your head that felt brilliant and original, only to later realize you had read or heard it somewhere else before? Maybe you were in a conversation and confidently shared a thought, believing it came from your own reflection, and then someone pointed out that it was almost word for word from a podcast, a book, or even from their own mouth weeks earlier. Or perhaps you were brainstorming creatively and suddenly felt like a genius, only to discover later that the new idea was actually from a film you watched years ago. This is more common than you might think, and it isn't a sign of dishonesty or lack of intelligence. It's a quirk of how memory works. The phenomenon is called cryptomnesia, literally hidden memory, when your brain retrieves information but forgets its source, leading you to mistake it for your own creation. It's the psychological version of déjà vu, but instead of feeling like you've lived through something before, it makes you believe you've generated something that was actually borrowed. Let's break down what's happening. Memory is not a perfect recording device. It doesn't store experiences in neatly labeled folders that tell you exactly when and where each thought originated. Instead, memory is reconstructive. Each time you recall something, your brain rebuilds it from fragments. Sometimes in that rebuilding, the tag that says where the information came from gets lost. When you later think of it, the brain serves it up as if it came fresh from your own mind. This is why cryptomnesia often happens in creative fields, writing, music, design, where the line between inspiration and originality can blur. But it's not limited to artists. It can affect anyone in daily life, influencing how we see ourselves and even how we make decisions. There are famous examples. The psychologist Carl Jung once admitted that a passage he thought he had written turned out to be nearly identical to something he had read years earlier and forgotten. George Harrison of the Beatles was famously sued because his hit My Sweet Lord sounded too much like another song. He insisted it was unintentional, and many psychologists agreed it could have been cryptomnesia at work. But it doesn't just happen on grand scales. It happens in small, everyday ways that shape how we understand ourselves. Imagine you're telling a story at dinner, certain it's your experience, and then someone points out that it actually happened to them. Or you believe you came up with a witty phrase, but it turns out it was from a TV show you watched in passing. These moments can feel embarrassing, even unsettling, because they challenge the idea that we are the sole authors of our thoughts. And that brings us to a deeper question. How many of our ideas are truly ours? The brain is constantly absorbing and recycling information, mixing pieces of things we've read, heard, and experienced into new forms. Originality, in a way, is always built from borrowed material. What feels like a sudden spark of genius may actually be the resurfacing of forgotten fragments. This doesn't diminish creativity, it reframes it. Instead of seeing yourself as a lone inventor, it reminds you that thinking is a collective process. Every conversation, book, or song you've encountered becomes part of the raw material your brain works with. The risk, however, is when we stop recognizing this interplay and start believing every resurfacing thought is uniquely ours. That's when cryptomnesia can distort not just our creativity, but also our self-perception. Neuroscience gives us some insight here. Research shows that the brain uses different networks for remembering content versus remembering the source of that content. The hippocampus, for example, helps bind together details like where and when something happened. If that binding is weak or fades over time, the source can slip away while the content remains. This makes cryptomnesia almost inevitable. It's not a flaw of character, it's a feature of how memory works. But here's where it becomes practically important. Cryptomnesia can mislead us in subtle but significant ways. In creative work, it might lead to unintentional plagiarism. In personal life, it might create false confidence in your originality or insight. In decision-making, it can make you believe a thought is intuitive wisdom, when in fact it's borrowed advice. So how can you work with this phenomenon instead of being undermined by it? The first step is awareness. Simply knowing that cryptomnesia exists changes how you relate to your thoughts. Instead of assuming every idea is completely your own, you can adopt a mindset of curiosity. Where might this have come from? What sources might be woven into this? This shift not only reduces embarrassment when overlaps occur, but also deepens humility. You realize you are part of a web of influences, not an isolated mind. The second step is to strengthen source memory. This means being intentional about noting where your ideas come from. For example, when you read something that resonates, jot it down with a note about its source. When you hear an idea in conversation, acknowledge it aloud. That's a great point. I'll remember you said that. This practice not only sharpens your recall but also gives credit where it's due, reinforcing relationships instead of accidentally straining them. The third step is to embrace collaboration with your own influences. Instead of fearing that your ideas aren't purely original, recognize that creativity thrives on recombination. Take inspiration consciously, draw from books, podcasts, conversations, and then deliberately remix them into something new. When you acknowledge your influences, cryptomnesia becomes less likely because you're actively engaging with where your thoughts come from rather than letting them resurface untagged. There's also a philosophical angle worth exploring. The phenomenon of cryptomnesia reminds us that the boundary between self and others is more porous than we like to believe. We often imagine our minds as sealed chambers producing unique ideas, but in reality, they are more like open ecosystems. Thoughts move between us, evolve, and reappear. In this sense, cryptomnesia isn't just a glitch in memory. It's a mirror showing us the interconnected nature of human thought. And here's something empowering. You can turn this awareness into a tool for self-growth. By asking yourself regularly, whose voice am I hearing in my head right now? You can separate the echoes of others from your authentic reflections. Sometimes you may discover that a belief you hold passionately isn't really yours. It was absorbed from a parent, a teacher, or a cultural narrative. Recognizing this gives you the power to choose whether to keep it or let it go. In other words, the study of cryptomnesia is not just about avoiding accidental plagiarism. It's about reclaiming agency over your mental landscape. Because when you know how thoughts flow into your mind, you can engage with them consciously instead of being led by them unconsciously. And that awareness is where true originality begins. One fascinating implication of cryptomnesia is how it shapes collaboration. When you're working in a group, ideas bounce around so quickly that it's easy to lose track of who said what. Hours or days later, you might believe you came up with something that was actually sparked by someone else. This isn't necessarily theft. It's simply how the brain processes collective thinking. But being aware of it can make you a better collaborator. If you cultivate the habit of acknowledging contributions in the moment, that's an interesting point you just made, I'll think more about it. You reinforce memory pathways that tie the idea to its source. This not only strengthens relationships, but also reduces the likelihood of future misunderstandings. Cryptomnesia also challenges the way we think about authenticity. Many people worry, if my thoughts are built from others' ideas, does that mean I have no originality? The truth is that originality is rarely about creating something from nothing. It's about synthesis, taking influences and recombining them in ways no one else has done. Every writer, musician, or philosopher you admire was influenced by countless others, even if they weren't always consciously aware of it. Recognizing this doesn't diminish creativity, it actually frees you. It means you don't have to pressure yourself to be a solitary genius. Instead, you can focus on how you remix the collective pool of ideas into something that carries your unique perspective. Think of your mind as a library. Every interaction, every book, every movie adds to the collection. When you sit down to think, you're not starting with a blank slate. You're wandering through the shelves. Cryptomnesia happens when you pull a book off the shelf, forget who wrote it, and assume you're the author. But the richness of your creativity comes from the fact that you have access to this vast collection in the first place. The key is to learn how to browse consciously instead of blindly. Let's get practical. One exercise you can try is the influence journal. Each week, jot down the books, podcasts, conversations, or even random online posts that stood out to you. By writing them down, you're strengthening the link between the idea and its source. Later, when those ideas resurface, you'll be more likely to remember where they came from. Another technique is the pause and trace. Whenever you have an idea that excites you, pause for a moment and ask, where have I encountered something like this before? Even if you can't pinpoint it exactly, the act of questioning makes you more aware of the possibility of outside influence. Over time, this habit sharpens both your memory and your humility. For those in creative fields, there's also the practice of deliberate crediting. Instead of fearing overlap, embrace it. If you write a piece inspired by something you once read, acknowledge that influence. If you use a phrase that stuck with you from a conversation, mention it. This doesn't dilute your contribution. It enriches it by showing you are engaged in a dialogue with others. In fact, many of the most respected thinkers and artists are those who openly trace their lineage of inspiration. But cryptomnesia isn't only about external ideas. It also reveals something about your relationship with yourself. Sometimes what feels like an outside thought is actually an earlier version of your own thinking that you forgot. Perhaps you journaled about something months ago, and when the thought resurfaces, it feels new because you've lost track of its origin. This is a reminder that even within your own mind, You are constantly rediscovering yourself, and that too can be a gift. It shows that growth isn't linear, it's cyclical. You revisit themes, refine them, and weave them into your evolving identity. On a deeper level, Cryptomnesia invites us to question the very notion of ownership of thoughts. Philosophers have long debated whether ideas belong to individuals or to culture as a whole. When you realize how porous the boundaries are between your mind and the world around you, you begin to see yourself less as an isolated thinker and more as part of a collective stream of consciousness. This perspective can be liberating. Instead of clinging to every idea as mine, you start to see thinking as participation in an ongoing conversation that stretches across time and space. And in that recognition, you gain both humility and a deeper sense of connection. So what does all this mean for your daily life? It means that when an idea comes to you, don't just ask, "Is this original?" Ask instead, "How can I use this idea responsibly? How can I shape it into something meaningful for myself and others?" Whether the spark came from your own reflection or from something you absorbed years ago, what matters is how you work with it now. It also means paying attention to the subtle voices that echo in your head. Sometimes you might realize that a belief you've carried isn't authentically yours. It's a fragment of someone else's opinion, absorbed without question. Becoming aware of this gives you the power to decide, do I want to keep this, or do I want to let it go? This is where Cryptomnesia becomes not just a curiosity of memory, but a tool for critical thinking and self-discovery. Because if you can discern the origins of your thoughts, you can also discern which ones align with your values and which ones don't. Let's end with a simple exercise you can try today. Think of an idea you believe is strongly yours, something you say often, or a belief you hold firmly. Then ask yourself, where did I first hear this? Can I trace its lineage? If you can, give credit. If you can't, sit with the possibility that it may not be entirely yours. Neither outcome diminishes you. Instead, it enriches your awareness of how thought flows through you. In the end, the effect of other people's thoughts doesn't have to be something to fear. It can be a reminder that you are part of something larger, that your creativity and your insights are woven into the broader fabric of human thinking. By becoming conscious of Cryptomnesia, you don't just protect yourself from error, you unlock a more grounded, more connected, and more intentional way of engaging with your own mind. If this exploration of hidden memory gave you a new perspective on your thoughts, share it with someone who might also wonder where their ideas really come from. And subscribe to Mind Unlocked, where every video gives you another tool for better thinking, helping you not only understand your mind, but also use it with greater clarity, honesty, and purpose.